Okay, maybe we'll start for all those people who are timely. Hello, my name's Wendy Craig, and I'm the Scientific Director of PREVNet. And on behalf of our team, I would like to welcome everybody to our webinar today. Wherever you are located, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous people. We are bringing today's webinar from the Community of Practice to address teen dating violence, funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. We're really excited about what we're offering today. The webinar is in quantitative research methods for assessing teen dating violence, and it's led by Dr. Deinera Exner-Cortens from the University of Calgary. Before I introduce her, I will just go through our format today. Deinera will present for approximately 40 minutes, and during her presentation, we invite you to type any comments or questions that you may have for her into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will track these questions and then pull from them and present them to Deinera at the end of her presentation during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, in the chat box, you will see a link to the evaluation, and that's an evaluation of this particular webinar. We really value the responses that people provide us through these evaluations, and they help us guide us when we're planning for future webinars. All of your feedback is anonymous, so please take, and it is really only 2 minutes at the end to complete the survey. Once you have completed the evaluation form, you will be directed to a website where you will be prompted to enter your full name and email address. And once you've done that, a certificate of attendance will be generated and emailed to you. And I just want to stress that even though you fill in the part with your name in order to get the certificate of attendance, your name is not associated or attached to your evaluation form at all. The evaluations are anonymous in terms of your feedback. The webinar is being recorded today, so after the webinar, we will send out a link to everyone that's registered so they can share that recording or listen to it if they weren't able to join us today. We will also share English and French versions of today's presentation slides. So that's the background material, and now it is my true pleasure to introduce Dr. Deinera Exner-Cortens. She is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary and is jointly appointed to the Department of Psychiatry, Cummings School of Medicine, University of Calgary. She is also a full member in the Alberta Children's Hospital Research Institute and the O'Brien Institute for Public Health, and an associate member in the Madison Center for Mental Health Research and Education. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology from Cornell University and a Master's of Public Health from Boston University. Her research focuses on evaluating healthy relationships, mental health promotion activities in schools and community settings, developing and evaluating implementing support tools for school-based mental health, healthy relationship service delivery, and 3, prevention of adolescent dating violence. In her work, she collaborates with a number of community and research partners, both provincially and nationally. She currently holds an early career award in supporting child and youth mental health outcomes in Alberta school settings, sponsored by the Alberta Health Services Polywise. It is truly a great pleasure, and she's truly to have her with us today, and she's truly an expert in the field. We are delighted that she's willing to share her expertise and knowledge. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to her.
Thanks, Wendy. All right, can you see my slides okay? I'll take that as a yes. Great. So today I'm going to be presenting, as Wendy talked about, on quantitative measurement, including how to go about choosing a measure, a review of some of the measures that are out there, and then thinking about some other ways to capture program changes other than surveys. This is the first in a series of measurement webinars that will be hosted, also qualitative and I believe arts-based and Indigenous methodologies. But if you're a community of practice member for this funding, you have to report some quantitative data, and so we're hoping that this webinar today will help you as you begin to do that. So again, we'll be going over some considerations when choosing a measure, a review of some existing measures, and thinking about some other methodologies. And I'm hoping to have as much interaction with you as I can given the format. So Stacy will be replying to you as you ask questions so that I can see them. And at the end, there will definitely be a good amount of time for you to ask questions that you have in your particular project about maybe some surveys that you're thinking of. Okay, and the goal of today's webinar is to support all of you, but in particular those of you that are members of the community of practice with this funding in your measurement decisions. So to start, we're going to think about how to choose a measure, because of course I'll tell you about some of the measures that are out there for dating violence so that you can think about whether those are the right fit, but more important is sort of the foundational piece about what do we even think about when we're choosing a measure. So obviously we won't do a full think, pair, share today, but I think these are really good questions for you to reflect on, particularly, what does the word measurement mean to you as part of your intervention research project? And what do you think are important things to consider when choosing a measure? And I'll just take a minute or two if you have any thoughts on these that you want to type in the chat box. I'll be able to see them, but if not, that's totally fine. And I think as you sort of embark on your measurement choosing process, these are good questions to consider regardless. So I'll just wait a minute or two and see if anyone has any thoughts, and then we'll move on. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions come up, which is totally fine. So we'll move on to the rest of the webinar. So what is our goal when we think about measurement and intervention research? The goal is for quantitative measurement and qualitative, and really any form when we're thinking about program evaluation, is to detect change in the outcomes that are important for our intervention. But there's actually a lot of pieces of information in this simple sentence. What's change? What are outcomes? How do we define important? And those are all things that we want to think about when we're choosing a measure. So what are the key components of our intervention is really important if we're thinking about both what's important and what kind of outcomes. What outcomes are most important, of course, and who is our target population? And this is really important because, as I'll talk about, a lot of our measures have been designed for majority youth. They may not be a good fit, and so we'll talk a little bit about adaptation to measures, as this is often something that we need to do to make measures a good fit for our target population. So before even starting to think about which measures to choose for your project, I think it's really important to have a well-defined logic model. If you have a well-defined logic model, then you will much more easily be able to say which outcomes are important and which you're going to measure. And it also lets us more easily match assessment tools to attended outcomes. So just, I'm sure many of you have a logic model, but just to go over the basic pieces of it. So in a logic model, we have our program techniques and strategies at the start. Then we want to include mediators. So those are the risk and protective factors that link to our longer term outcome of interest. So for dating violence, if preventing dating violence perpetration is our longer term outcome of interest, we want to look at mediators that we know are associated with that outcome of interest. And depending on who you're working with and where you're working and the level you're working at, there's a lot of things you could put in this box. So for our project, we're doing a gender transformative healthy relationships program. And so for us, a really important mediator or risk factor is adherence to gender role norms. So for us, that would be a mediator we look at, and it's linked to our longer term outcome of interest, dating violence perpetration. For other people, it might be relationships with caring adults, or relationships with peers, or individual skills and capacities. So lots of things that could go here, and this should really stem from what your intervention is targeted to either prevent or promote. And then here, of course, putting the techniques and strategies that you're going to use to actually either prevent that risk factor or promote a protective factor. So this first part of the logic model, from program techniques to mediators, is known as the theory of the intervention. So how are you actually going to get from what you're doing, whatever you're doing in the program, to the thing that you're trying to change? What is the link between those two things? And, you know, if you haven't done this, it's a really important process to go through to actually specify what is in your program and what are you doing and how do you think it's going to link to these risk or protective factors. Then we have developmental theory. So this is how those mediators link to our longer term outcome of interest. And so this usually comes from theory and research as well as your own practice experience. So why, if we're changing these risk and protective factors, should we expect to see a change in our longer term outcome of interest, for example, dating violence perpetration? So making sure that you have a really well specified logic model, ideally that's drawing on research, of course, but also potentially pilot experience with your target population, your own practice experience, will make the whole measurement choosing experience a lot easier. So that whole thing together is our logic model. We also can look at moderators. So these would be factors that may alter the intervention impact. So for us, for example, we've looked for racialized youth because of literature on marginalized masculinities, and we know there might be differential impact of intervention, and so we look at that as a moderator. In other work that I've done, we've looked at adverse childhood experiences, and so these would be things that, knowing your target population as well as the target of your intervention, you think might alter how the program works for certain groups. So thinking about what works for whom. So you might think about those. You may also look at moderators that alter developmental process. So if you're able to change some risk or protective factor, does how that ultimately links to our longer term outcome of interest differ for different groups? I will say in the evaluation literature, we're typically more focused on moderators that alter intervention impact as opposed to factors that alter developmental processes, but that is something you might also want to look at. And so if you don't have a well-specified logic model, I would definitely recommend starting here and spending the time to really sketch out what your program is, how it's going to create change before thinking about any kind of measurement. And this is an example logic model from some of the work we're doing with Wise Guys. And so we go over what's in the program, the learning objectives, how it's going to impact short-term outcomes, or we could think of these as mediators, towards our longer-term outcomes of interest. So theory of the intervention in the first piece, and then developmental theory in the second. And if you look at any logic model in published literature, it might not follow that exact schematic I showed, but any good logic model will always have these two pieces embedded. So thinking about what are key components of our intervention, how do we think about that? Once we have that, are we going to measure all of the outcomes specified in our logic model or a selection? This is a really important question depending on how much time you have with your target population, how many people are in your sample. That'll kind of shape some of this. So starting to think about which outcomes are we going to measure. A lot of the programs that we work on are what we call multi-target programs. So ideally they are creating change in more than one long-term outcome, but we may or may not be able to measure all of those for a number of reasons. And so we want to think about which outcomes are we going to measure. As part of that, we can also think about, are we interested in measuring more short or medium term, or we might say more proximal outcomes? So those would be the risk and protective factors, or longer term, more distal outcomes. So short and medium term outcomes include things like knowledge, attitudes and beliefs, and potentially behavioral intentions, and we'll talk about each of those. And longer term outcomes include things like behavior. And in an ideal world, yes, we would be assessing for behavior change, but that's not always possible. We can't always follow people through the time period needed to see a certain outcome emerge. Even dating violence perpetration We're working with youth in grades 9 and 10, and although, you know, it's certainly there, it increases as they get older, and so it's going to be harder to pick up unless we can follow them for a couple of years. Our sample size might not be big enough. There might be lots of reasons why we can't assess longer-term behavioral outcomes. In that case, that's where it's really, really important to have a very well-specified logic model, because you're going to argue that you can only assess short-term outcomes like attitudes or knowledge change, but you have a really solid justification for how those short-term outcomes or mediators are linked to that longer-term outcome, because you'll want to show that and say, you know, we showed positive change on attitudes, and so we think this holds promise for preventing our ultimate long-term outcome, dating violence perpetration, because of theory, research, and practice experience. If you're interested in longer term or are able to look at longer term outcomes and you're collecting data at 3 or more time points, you can think about if there's potential mediators that we're interested in assessing. So you need 3 or more time points ideally in order to get the right sequencing. So you do the program, you have an outcome, and then in between you have mediators. You can do it with less, but it's not a very strong argument if you don't have 3 or more time points for mediators. So this is something you could think about depending on the setup of your data. And then this is something I've grown increasingly interested in, which is differential response to intervention. I think, especially if you're working, as a lot of projects I know in the community of practice are, on more of a universal program, you really want to think about not just is it working, but who is it working for? And in particular, in that universal population, we know that there are youth who are more vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And so it's great, of course, if the program shows a main effect, or we can say it's working for everybody. But we in particular want to make sure that our universal programs are working for youth who are most vulnerable. And how that's defined, most vulnerable, of course, depends on your program and population. But I would really encourage you to think about this as you think about structuring your measurement tools more broadly. So a really important key concept when we think about any measure of behavior, and in particular dating violence perpetration, is the idea of base rate. So this is the prevalence at pretest or baseline, so before the intervention happens, of a behavior in the study population. And the reason this is important is it tells us how big our sample would need to be to capture change. And so when I was saying, you know, is your sample big enough to capture that long-term change in behavior, this is what I was referring to. And the formal way that we do this is something called power analysis. And if you aren't familiar or comfortable, and this is a question that you have, I can chat a bit about at the end, but it's something that you may want to get some consulting to figure out, you know, are we really going to have the sample to pick up this long-term outcome? Or would it be better for us to look at a shorter term outcome and make that link theoretically? So just as an example, we know, at least for the age range I work with, which is grades 9 and 10, about 50 to 60% of them are dating. So right away, even if you had 500 youth in your sample, you're cutting them down by half because we only want to assess dating violence in youth who are dating. And we'll talk about that at the end. We define it very broadly, but we want to make sure that the people we're assessing it in have had, you know, an opportunity to experience the behavior. So 50% of our sample is dating, which is about typical. For universal populations, of course, that could be very different depending on the population you're working with. And about 20% of our sample experiences physical teen dating violence, which again is a pretty typical rate in universal samples, could be much higher or lower in your population. That would mean that, you know, by the time we cut our sample down by half for dating, and then only 20% are experiencing physical dating violence, only about 50 youth are reporting physical dating violence at baseline, which for quantitative data is actually a pretty small sample. We can do things with it, but it's pretty small. And that was starting with 500 youth in our sample, which is a lot. And so the purpose of this example is to demonstrate why it can be really hard to pick up change in behaviors like dating violence when the base rate or that prevalence at pretest is fortunately fairly low. Of course, still something we're all trying to prevent, but it's not that in most samples, 80% of youth are experiencing dating violence. And so we are looking at a fairly small subset within our larger sample. And so we have to think about, is this sample really big enough to capture change in the outcome? And even without doing a formal power analysis, if you think about, well, I think I'm only going to be able to have about 100 youth in my sample, and you start to do these calculations and realize that you're only going to have probably 5 or 10 youth reporting dating violence, you could probably say, without even doing a formal analysis, that's not going to be enough to really look at change. And so thinking through this, even just conceptually, can start to help you understand whether you're going to have the sample size to look at behavior, or whether it would be better to look at something like attitudes or knowledge, where we don't run into this base rate issue. So we talked about this. We want to pull our outcomes directly from our very well specified logic model, but what if we have more than one outcome, which again, many of you may have because we work on what we call multi-target programs, so trying to change multiple long-term behaviors. Then we have to think about something called primary and secondary outcomes. So the primary outcome is the outcome that you consider to be the most important in your study. And if you're doing a controlled outcome evaluation, quasi-experimental or randomized trial, it's now very important that you register that trial with something like clinicaltrials.gov, and they're going to directly ask you, what is your primary outcome? And you have to specify that upfront and ahead of time. But even if you're not doing a trial like that, still really important to think, what is the most important outcome? I would say for this funding stream, some of that decision has been made for you, but even within that, there's still decisions you can make. So I'll just say, for example, for us, we're going to have about 800 youth in our sample, and even with that, the number that will experience dating violence is pretty small. And so we haven't made dating violence our primary outcome because we are worried due to base rate issues that it will be hard to pick up change. And so we've made our primary outcome bystander behavior for violence prevention. Because in our pilot work, well, one, it gets around base rate issues because everyone can participate in bystander intervention. And two, in our pilot work, we see, an effect that is big enough that we think we'll be able to pick up change. And so it's not that we won't measure dating violence, we will, but we haven't made that our primary outcome because we're worried about having too small a sample size. But you can still measure those other things. So we pick a primary, that's our most important outcome. That's the outcome we make sure our sample size is big enough to detect change in. And then we can have what we call secondary outcomes. These are additional study outcomes that might add additional evidence for change in the primary outcome. So in our study, our primary outcome, as I said, is bystander behavior, and we'll make sure our sample size is big enough to be able to pick up change in that outcome should the change be there. And then dating violence perpetration is a secondary outcome. So we'll certainly still look at it, but we haven't designed our study to pick up change necessarily because we would need a much, much larger sample size than we're able to get. So again, just to illustrate, it's basically what I just said. So you want to detect change in teen dating violence perpetration, but you probably won't have the sample size to pick up change, which is sort of the situation that we're in. And so then you want to choose a different primary outcome, and then you can still measure perpetration, but as more of a secondary outcome. So this rubric might help you think about, from your logic model and considering your sample size and considering what's most important for your intervention, what do we want our primary outcome to be, and then what are some other things we might also measure. So thinking along that continuum of outcomes, we've kind of put this here, thinking about it in sort of a strength of claim way. So at the far left end, we have knowledge, followed by attitudes, beliefs and norms, behavioral intentions, and behavior. And this is a pretty typical way to categorize quantitative outcomes in the dating violence field. And so if we think about knowledge, that's at the far end of the continuum because it is the weakest in terms of making a link to behavior, because as you can see in the schematic, it's the furthest away from behavior. So it certainly may be necessary to change knowledge to change behavior, but we know that it's not specific. So I know I shouldn't be eating sugary food, but I'm still doing it because it's tasty. And so I do have the knowledge, but I haven't changed my behavior. So certainly it may be important to assess knowledge, but unless the target of your intervention is really knowledge change, I would encourage you to think about assessing attitudes, beliefs, or norms as opposed to knowledge as a primary outcome, because it is the weakest form of evidence, though still important. Following down the continuum, we get to attitudes, beliefs, and norms. So these are a little closer to behavior, still not a one-to-one link. So just because we've changed attitudes about something doesn't mean someone will change their behavior, but we are closer. And so this gets measured, attitudes in particular, gets measured in a lot of dating violence evaluations where the sample size isn't big enough to pick up behavior change. And so they'll look at attitudes instead. And so that might be a really realistic outcome for your study, depending on sample size as well as the target of your intervention. Following down, we then get to behavioral intention, step closer to actual behavior. So now I hopefully have the knowledge, I have good attitudes, and I actually intend to do a specific behavior. Of course, things still happen between intentions and actually doing something, but we are a little bit closer. And so we're going to go over some behavioral intentions measures that you might like to look at. Our primary outcome for our study falls within behavioral intentions as well. So looking at bystander behavior outcomes. So again, you want to think along this continuum and think about, what would we like to measure? I mean, yes, ideally, we'd all like to show long-term behavior change as compared to a control group, but that's not always realistic for a number of reasons, both, given the target of our intervention, the sample we're working with, the community we're working with, that may not be a design that's feasible. There's lots of reasons why we can't get to behavior, and thinking about evaluation in real world settings, which is what we're all doing, we have to kind of balance out those competing needs. And so thinking where, how strong of evidence can you get while also balancing what's realistic working with your community. And of course, it's also really important to choose a measure that matches the context of your study population. I've told you a lot about how we pick measures, and I'm going to tell you about some measures, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't match the context of the youth that you're working with, it's not a good measure. And so you really want to review potential items. And when we go through some of the measures I've highlighted, some of the issues in some of these measures, but you'll want to review those measures thinking about your youth and what would need to change to make it appropriate. And often it is something, usually some small wording changes to make it appropriate. So how do you know if it matches the context and if it's a good measure? Experience, either your own or others, if you haven't used these measures before. Reach out to other researchers if you're in a community of practice to see what they've used. A lot of these measures on paper look good, but actually using them is a whole different ballgame. So please feel free to reach out to myself. If I've used them, I'm happy to let you know, or other researchers in the community of practice to get their real advice on what using this measure is like. Hopefully piloting, depending on how your project is set up. Ideally, before we go into our full study, we do at least one pilot with our target population on the measure. So we've been piloting our measures for the past couple of years. We started with quite a few and have winnowed down measures that just kind of don't work. They don't really seem to pick up change. The youth don't like them. So now we're at a place where we have our final set of measures and they've been well piloted. And that just lets us go into our large scale evaluation feeling confident that, at least we think the measures we have are right. Hopefully we'll also see change, but we've got the right measures. And having done this before and not piloted, and then at the end, when you're not finding things, not knowing if it's because the program didn't work or the measures weren't right, if you can pilot, and I know it can certainly be a luxury, I'd really recommend that you do that. And finally, getting service user feedback. So sitting down with youth that are in the age range of the youth that you're wanting to work with, have them look through the measure. They will tell you things, and I always tell youth before we do this, we might not be able to change everything, but we want your honest feedback, and get them to tell you. It could be something as simple as the instructions, getting a definition of dating that actually works for your target population, changing some of the wording, changing the response options, changing how the measure is structured on the page. You'll get lots of great feedback, so I would definitely encourage you to do this as well. What if you need to adapt a measure? So really, I think this is akin to adapting evidence-based programs. So you want to proceed carefully and thoughtfully, just as you would if you were adapting a program. And just like with programs, I think we can think about it in terms of green light, yellow light, and red light. So green light adaptations would be something like making the formatting of the measure more appropriate, changing words without changing the meaning of an item. So perhaps the youth in your sample will say, well, we don't use the word teen, or we don't use this word, use this word instead. And if it doesn't change the meaning of the item, that's totally fine. Proceed with caution would be yellow changes. So this would be deleting whole subscales. You may have a really good reason to do that, but you want to think about that and why you're doing it. Changing item order, this might seem silly, but a lot of times measure developers have put the items in a particular order, and that's actually been tested. They've made sure that that's the right order for items to go in. And so before changing it, you want to really think about why you're doing that and potential implications for responding. And then red, which isn't stop so much, but stop and think carefully before you do it. And at this point, if you're doing red type changes, think about reaching out to the measure developer and just saying, I'm thinking of doing this. I spent a lot of time with these measures and painstakingly thought about every item on there. And so it's totally fair that some of those items may not fit your context, but just check in with them. Maybe they have a suggestion about a different item, or can just provide insight into what that change might mean for interpreting the measure. So this would be deleting items full scale, or revising wording in a way that changes the meaning of an item. So measure quality, and I saw in the text box, someone said reliability and validity is how we measure, how we assess measures, which is true, and I'll talk about that on this slide, although I hope from what I've discussed so far, you can see that there's actually lots of different ways that we assess measure quality. So reliability is really about how consistent are the items on the measure. Do they all go together? Are they all kind of getting at the same thing? This is typically measured with something called internal consistency reliability, or an alpha coefficient. You might see that in the published literature, or something called test retest. For either one of those, something above 0.7 is good. And everything I'm telling you today for COP members is in a compendium we put together, so you don't need to furiously write it down. You'll be getting all of this after the webinar. Validity is very important. So is this measure actually assessing what it's supposed to? I'm telling you that all these items assess dating violence perpetration, but do they really, and not something else? For behavior measures, this is actually a little bit easier because we're measuring acts, things that people are actually doing that a group of people have decided represent perpetration, though of course we can debate about that. For things like attitudes, this is harder and very important. Are those attitudes really tapping how you feel about dating violence, or are they measuring something else? And the thing about validity is there's not one test that you can do. There's lots of different kinds of validity. You can have experts look at it. You can look at it, youth can look at it and say, yes, that's it. You can do more formal statistical tests. But basically with validity, we're trying to get the weight of the evidence. Does the weight of the evidence suggest that this is a measure with evidence of validity? And we try not to say valid measure, because no measure is valid across all samples and populations. And so we just want to think about, does this measure have evidence of validity? for the youth that I want to use it with. And so when you're reading measure development articles, you want to have a critical eye to the types of validity that they talk about and how much evidence they're showing for that. And again, in the compendium that you'll get, we go through some specific different kinds of validity that may or may not apply to all measures, but really you're wanting to look at those articles for what are they saying that they did, and how confident do I feel reading this that they are actually measuring what they say they're measuring and not something else. And so of course our goal would be to get a measure that's both reliable and valid. If we can, this is easier said than done because of course we have to find a measure that fits our population and fits our study and our intervention, but ideally this is what we will end up with. So just to recap, we want to think about what our logic model says are the most important outcomes to assess. We want to think about the sample size we need to see change in those outcomes. We want to think about evidence of measure quality, including reliability and validity evidence. And then, and very importantly, I mean, all of that matters, but does this measure actually match the context of my population? So now I'm going to just spend a little bit of time going through potential measures. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because you will be getting these in the compendium, but I'll just talk about sort of our process and then a quick review of some of the measures in the compendium. So just so you know how we came up with these, so a couple of years ago, I did a systematic review of all teen dating violence measures, attitudes, and behavioral measures with evidence of validity and reliability. And then I worked with a grad student who couldn't be here today, Kaylee DeFrance, who updated my review using the same methodology to make sure we'd captured any new measures that were published since I did that review. So we think we've got a pretty comprehensive scan of the dating violence literature for published measures, which is a caveat. And then we looked through those articles, really thinking about quality and content coverage, and we pulled more measures than we ultimately put in the compendium, but we thought it would be good to narrow it down so you weren't choosing from 10 different measures. But certainly, if you're interested in a particular category of measurement and you don't see a measure that you like, feel free to reach out to me, and if we have some other ones in that category, I'll send them off to you. But we tried to narrow them down to measures that we thought kind of captured the breadth of things that community of practice members are interested in assessing. We also looked at ongoing evaluation studies. So one of the tricks with measurement is these measures are not developed for program evaluation. They're typically developed to assess prevalence. And so a measure that's good at assessing prevalence isn't necessarily good at assessing change. And so we want to make sure we're in step with what the dating violence field writ large is doing in terms of evaluation. And so we pulled measures from evaluation studies to make sure that we were going to be measuring things that other researchers are measuring, and also sort of as a check on what seems to be good for program evaluation, not just what's good generally. We included a very simple schematic, sort of to give you a sense of some of that measure quality piece based on our own reading of these articles. So 1 star would mean it has limited evidence, so maybe just reliability, no validity evidence. Probably no measure testing, but maybe it was used in some past intervention research. 2 stars would be promising evidence, so some reliability and validity evidence, but often used frequently in past intervention research studies. And 3 stars would be strong evidence, so it's got lots of reliability and validity evidence, hopefully used in also past intervention research. Yeah, so that's our simple schematic. Hopefully it helps you as you're picking articles or measures. So we've put our measures into 4 categories: knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and norms, behavioral intentions and behaviors, that same schematic I talked about earlier. Just some common limitations across all measures. Heteronormativity is a problem that plagues the teen dating violence measurement literature. I've tried in the ones that I'm showing you to kind of highlight where this is a problem, but certainly this is something you may need to adapt in the measures that you're using. Outdated language, measure development takes a really long time, and so particularly for newer measures of cyber dating violence, by the time it's tested, it might not be super relevant, and so you may need to update some of that. And of course, the number one problem in dating violence measurement, it's all self-report. And we will put this always in our limitations section, and we acknowledge that it's a problem, but it's something that is a problem across the field. So just to go, so I'm going to show you all the measures that are in the compendium and then some of the items. So for knowledge, we found two measures that we included. So one is called the Teen Screen for Dating Violence, TDV knowledge, and that's been very well tested, has not been used in intervention research, but is well tested. And then the Dating Violence Awareness Scale, which is not well tested, but is being used as part of a national study that PREVNet's involved with, so is being used in intervention research. And so these are the knowledge items for dating violence awareness. So in your opinion, what percentage of students will experience violence? So that's just a general knowledge check. You know, again, female and male students, which may not work for your population. And so you could just ask among all students or youth. You don't need to do it by gender necessarily, unless that is something that is important to your project, as it was to this project where this scale is from. For attitudes, beliefs, and norms, there's a lot more because, as I mentioned, a lot of dating violence evaluation looks at attitudes, not very much looks at knowledge. So attitudes about aggression in dating situations, the acceptance of violence scale, the dating abuse awareness scale, which we're currently using in our Wise Guys work, and acceptance of couple violence. So we found 4 scales that we thought would be useful in your work. So this is the DAAS, the Dating Abuse Awareness Scale. This is one that we're using right now. Pretty typical attitudes scale. So rate how abusive you think the following items are. This is just a selection of items. You know, again, heteronormative language. So think about changing this to dating partner or sexual partner or other things that fit. Acceptance of couple violence, again, pretty typical attitudes. A boy angry enough to hit his girlfriend must love her very much, thinking about attitudes about violence. Again, heteronormative language, so this is just an example of an adaptation that you could do. So instead of specifying gender, you could just say someone angry enough to hit their dating partner must love them very much. So that's just an example of how it's pretty easy to take out some of that heteronormative language, and can be really, really important because we do not want youth to feel excluded from our measure. And so especially with the attitude measures, which I think almost all of the ones we put in do have heteronormative language, really important to revise and review those to make it fit for your population. For behavioral intentions, we included 3 scales, so one on support seeking, one on bystander intentions, and one on help-seeking intentions. The help-seeking intentions one we included, although it has limited evidence because it has been used in several Canadian dating violence intervention studies. And the bystander behavior intention scale is being used right now in a large-scale US intervention study. So both of those in intervention contexts. The Teen Screen for Dating Violence has really good measure quality information, but to my knowledge has not previously been used in intervention research. These are just some of the behavioral intentions items from the help-seeking scale. So how likely would you be to talk to the following people if you had any of the problems listed below? So a problem with, again, boyfriend, girlfriend, could just say dating partner, sexual partner hurting you physically. You could also add categories to who they would go to as relevant for your youth population. So of course, we're hoping to see increased help seeking after our intervention and less people saying no one. These are from the bystander behavior. We're using this right now in some of our work. So these are just items that they might see. So did you see someone making rude or disrespectful comments about a girl's body or makeup? If you did see that, how likely would you be to try and stop something? Very, somewhat, neither, likely or unlikely, somewhat likely or very likely. So it does say male friend or peer because the scale was designed for use with male identified youth as part of a gender transformative program. But again, you could just say peer. And the nice thing about a behavioral intention item is it does get away from the base rate issue, because you're not asking, you know, did they do it? Did they have an opportunity? Everyone can answer this. So if you're in thinking about bystander type things and your sample's a bit smaller, you might want to make your primary outcome behavioral intentions, also assess actual behavior, but just to make sure you're not losing people because of not having the opportunity to respond. And then finally, behaviors, which ultimately is what we all want to see change, but as I've talked about, may or may not be something that you are actually able to assess in your evaluation as a primary outcome. So there's a number of behavior scales out there. If you start to look across them, they all are quite similar. They're all what we call ACT scales, so they're measuring actual things that people have experienced or done. And there's a limited number of acts that go on these scales, and so they all kind of look familiar. So we tried to not duplicate and just include ones that had different types of content. So the CADRI, Conflict and Adolescent Dating Relationships Inventory, one on cyber dating violence that's been well tested, the VIFA, which is in French. Obviously, you could translate any of these, but this one's already in French. Recent fearful dating experiences, this might be good with younger youth because it's more about fear than actual experience of violence behavior, and then a behavior scale for bystander behavior. So this is the CADRI, the Conflict and Adolescent Dating Relationships Inventory. And I see we're running out of time, so I'll go through the last ones quick. So the CADRI, I will give it an orange star. It's definitely the most well tested of all the behavioral scales. It is used the most in current dating violence evaluation studies. All the big studies going right now are either using this or one that's very, very similar called Safe Dates. So this is the one we're using because of all of that. Of course, it still has issues, which is why I'm giving it an orange star. But if you're going to measure behaviors and have room for a about 29 item scale, it is a good choice. And there's more in the compendium on this scale. This is the cyber dating violence inventory. So this is what I was saying about things getting outdated. So you might need to update what youth are using to make it relevant to your context. Facebook, for example, maybe not so relevant. So this would be a place where doing service user review would be really, really useful in making sure that the methods you're asking about are relevant. The Take Care scale, which is about bystander behavior. I like this one, the way they do it, because they both ask whether youth encountered it and then did they intervene. And so you can get rid of or take out of your sample youth who didn't encounter and just look at intervention. Again, as I was saying, that does mean you're going to lose part of your sample when they don't encounter it, which is why in smaller samples you may want to use a behavioral intention scale for bystander and then include actual behavior as a secondary outcome. And then this is the fearful dating experiences. So your date made you feel unsafe, you felt ashamed of the things your date did to you. So depending on your context, this might be more appropriate than some of the other more violent and aggressive acts items. And again, you can update the term date to make it more appropriate for your youth context. So finally, use of healthy relationship skills. Unfortunately, as a field, we've really focused on the negative, and so there's very little in terms of things that are tested for measure quality, for positive things specific to dating violence. And so this is one that has been used in a recent large-scale outcome evaluation to do with healthy relationship skills. But I am sorry to say there is a lot less of this because we're usually trying to measure a negative thing getting better as opposed to a positive thing getting better. But you may want to think about adding a positive measure as well, also to communicate, because I know a lot of your programs are strengths-based, that we're focusing on strengths as well as reducing violent behavior. So as I mentioned, anytime you're assessing for dating violence, you do want to ask if they've dated, because you only want to look at dating violence in the sample of youth that have actually dated and had an opportunity to experience. This is a question that we use. Have you ever had a dating relationship? A dating relationship is defined as the kind of relationship where you like a person, they like you back, and other people know you're together. This doesn't mean having to go on a formal date, but definitely alter the words or use a different screener that matches your youth population. And again, a really good place to get youth to tell you what the right definition of dating or sexual relationships is, and use that. I just want to point out for community of practice members, there's a big opportunity, I think, to ask some common questions. So there is no national data on dating violence in Canada, which is a huge gap when we're trying to plan prevention and intervention. And so we're recommending these 4 questions go on as many community of practice surveys as possible. They're going on ours in addition to the CADRI. If you don't have the sample size to actually look at change in dating violence, it also means you can ask about perpetration and victimization really quickly and in a way that lets you satisfy your reporting requirements for this grant and also contribute to data across all sites. These come from a national US survey called the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey. They've been very well tested. I helped contribute to their rewording back in 2012. And so in addition to helping us collect data nationally here, it would also let us compare to prevalence rates in the US, where these questions have been used for almost the past decade. So something to think about as you're preparing your surveys as a potential opportunity to ask common questions across all sites. And then just very quickly to highlight, there are other methodologies that you can use. And I know there's going to be other series in other webinars that will talk about this. Of any time you're doing evaluation, quantitative data are only part of the picture. We really need stories and lived experience to fully understand any experience in a program. And so quantitative data are great and important for many populations. They are important for the reporting requirements for this grant, but you do, if you can, also want to include multiple forms of data collection. We often use focus groups or semi-structured interviews with youth to collect qualitative data, but those can have some limits for adolescents who are still developing the metacognitive capacity to answer hard questions on interviews. And so we've developed a photo-based program evaluation that we've been using, which has been really effective. And my grad student right now is putting together a one-pager on this with our exact method to share with community of practice members in case you want to replicate it. We created this because we couldn't find any prior literature using photos to evaluate prevention programs with youth, which I was quite surprised by, but we've now created a method that we're very happy to share. And so we did this last year, and I will say it's the richest qualitative data I've ever collected. It's been really popular for knowledge translation and helped us to really develop a rich story from the qualitative data. So this is just one of our before photos. You know, this youth were asked to say what being a guy in their world meant before and after our program. So this youth took a picture of a lock to represent before, that he felt stuck in and forced to be themselves. And then after wise guys, a sense of clarity. This is just a very quick example of how photos can be used as another valid piece of program evaluation. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I know I went longer than 30 minutes, but we now have time for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Deinera. That was excellent. We really appreciate the comprehensiveness and all of the things that you covered. Can I highlight a few key questions for you?
Yes, please.
So one question was, thank you for your suggestions on measuring secondary outcomes, attitudes, behavioral intentions, when measuring a low base rate behavior. I'm curious if another possibility would be to measure related behaviors.
Yeah, certainly. So any behavior, you will always have a base rate base rate consideration. If it's not dating or sexual related, then you may not have that initial sample size reduction. So you could do that. And it really is just a question of, is that the primary outcome of your intervention? So if the primary outcome of your intervention you believe to be dating violence, then you'd want to measure something closely related to that. But if you believe the primary outcome of intervention is something else, like substance use, then you could measure that. I'm not sure if that's getting at the question, but certainly you could measure another behavior, just depending on what your logic model tells you are the most likely behavioral outcomes. And just remembering that any behavior will have base rate considerations and just thinking about how common that behavior is in your population.
Okay, great. There was another question, just they wanted to confirm that if you'd be hoping to see the mediator change in significance pre to post, just confirming.
Yes, you would.
And then they wondered how to measure cultural shifts in thinking beyond behavior.
That's such a good question, and one that, you know, the dating violence literature cannot answer at this time. We've been very focused on individual level behavior, too much focused on individual level behavior. So I think for cultural shifts, you know, I would gather, and this person can definitely clarify, you're thinking about norms. And so there are norm scales, not many. It may be a place where you need to look at measures that exist and create something. You know, I didn't talk too much about that. We do try not to create measures because to create a good measure is quite tricky. But there are times when, especially when we're measuring an area that has been ignored by the research literature, we need to do that. And if you're in that situation, try if you can to pull items from existing measures. And yeah, I think in that situation, you might have to, if it's for dating violence, we don't have a lot. There might be more on community norms for domestic violence. So you could maybe look into that and then try and adapt, you know, for a dating violence context. But I will say we have not done a good job. Our measures are very focused on individuals.
Okay, that's great. And what about like in a school setting? Could you assess like if like classrooms, or like can you just sort of think about different kinds of cultures within a school setting? Like how would you assess those?
Sure. So, you know, again, I think, and if you have a specific question, I would really welcome you to email me. I'll just put my email up because it kind of depends on your intervention. But for example, with our intervention, one of the things we hope that it changes is general school climate. And so there are school level measures of school climate that can be answered by youth or by teachers or by administrators. And so that's something that you could measure if that was something that from your logic model was a reasonable outcome of your intervention. And so there certainly are, you know, outside the dating violence literature, if you're in schools in particular, and the larger school mental health literature, or other organizations in industrial and organizational psychology on organizational climate and capital that you could start to pull from. So I think, you know, if you're trying to measure something that the dating violence literature in particular hasn't assessed, which if it's not individual behavior, it probably hasn't, looking to other literatures that kind of get at a similar thing and just seeing, so how can I take this measure and adapt it? So another thing that we measure for our teacher implementers is attitudes towards evidence-based practices, because that's an important predictor of implementation of programs. And there wasn't one for school providers in particular. And so we took an existing, very well-tested measure and just changed the wording slightly to make it appropriate for schools. So that would be an example of a green light adaptation. Because we didn't change the meaning of the items, we just changed some of the wording to make it appropriate to schools. So I think, you know, when you're thinking about some of these larger constructs, which are super important, or implementation, you know, there are other literatures, and certainly if you have a specific question, please send me an email. And if I know of a literature that might have looked into that, or even a specific measure, because we, in our work, use a lot of measures, not from dating violence, but from other literatures, I'm more than happy to answer that.
Okay, I think this next question is related, but it's a little bit different. And it's about asking about your continuum, and can it be extended to think about systemic change? So, you know, you ended at behavior, but could you keep going and put on like policies and community expectations and practices? Like,
oh, yeah, that would be great. We organize that continuum based on, again, what the limited dating violence literature kind of looks at and what interventions tend to look at in dating violence. But yes, please keep adding to it. I think, you know, it stops at individual behavior and misses a whole lot of context and other things that are important for ultimately preventing dating violence. And so, yes, please add to my continuum.
Okay, and I think you just flipped back to look at this last question. This other question is, if you could go back to this slide that you have up there now, you would like to add us to the surveys. For the question on the bottom left, what is meant by the phrase, with the exception of self-defense?
So this is a raging debate in the dating violence literature, but most measures now, when they measure perpetration, including the cadre, in the instructions will say not to count it if you did it in self-defense, because of concerns that we get a lot of gender parity in dating violence estimates in universal samples, which some researchers feel is because we're counting self-defense as violence when it's actually self-defense. And so most dating violence questions for perpetration in the prompts will say something about not counting it if it was in self-defense, because we don't want to pick that up. Now, you may want to pick that up, and then you could ask about that. If you do want to pick it up, I would suggest asking it separately. So you want to know, what was done as violence or aggression, and you want to know what was done as self-defense, but those are motivated likely by two different things, and so we'd want to ask two different questions. So that's a great question. Thank you for pointing that out. If you're going to ask about perpetration, it would be in step with the current literature to say something like, don't count the behavior if you did it in self-defense, because we're trying to get at context. As you will see when you see the compendium, our measures are also bad because they don't ask about context in which violence occurred. So where was it? How often was it? Why did it happen? If you have time and space on your survey, you can definitely prompt for those things. So if someone says, yes, I did this, then you can prompt them to say, okay, tell me a bit more about it. Unfortunately, we don't often have that time and space. In our case, we need to be in and out in 20 minutes, so we're not going to be able to ask about this. So that don't count it in self-defense is sort of a tiny way of getting at context, though, certainly not adequate, but thank you for asking why that's there.
Great. I'm just going to ask if there are any other questions. Please take a moment, and if you have them, we're happy to answer them, or I'm speaking on your behalf. I'm sure you're happy to answer them.
And you send me an email, because I know a lot of questions are very specific to specific programs, so feel free to reach out if you have a specific question.
Okay. There's one more. Do you want to?
That's fair. That's a fair point. Yeah, I think you could take it out of there. It's usually just on physical ones. I'll remove that. Thank you for pointing.
Sorry, I just wanted, there was people, not everybody can see. There's one more question that says, sorry, does that question specifically not imply that it is possible to force a partner to do sexual things against their will as self-defense?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I'm going to take that out. Good point. I will remove it from the compendium. Thank you. We'll just keep it. I would put it on anything that's physical, but that's a very good point. Thank you. 12 months.
Yeah, the next question is the limitation of the past 12 months typical, or can you ask about different lengths of time?
Yes. This is another raging debate in the measurement field. 12 months is typical, but it doesn't mean it's the right amount of time. Sometimes it's 6 months, sometimes it's ever, sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes it's 30 days. So I would say to be, because this isn't a behavior, I mean, in some relationships it happens a lot, but, if teens are coming in and out of dating relationships, it needs to be a little bit longer. You could try 30 days if you knew it was going on a lot, but I think 12 months is typical because we want them to think across a number of relationships. So this one, you can definitely change it. I think just knowing for your youth what's maybe appropriate, but you can certainly change it. It definitely has implications for how much dating violence you're going to be able to pick up. So again, I think a lot of them do 12 months because of the base rate issue I talked about. It introduces a bunch of recall issues. So yeah, I don't know if that you can change it for sure. What to change it to, there's no perfect answer because you're kind of trying to balance base rate with recall. So I would say do what seems right for your youth and population.
If I could just add to that, I also think if you're using it as a measure of your outcome, you want to make sure that that period of time doesn't overlap between your pre and post testing.
Yes.
So I think, and it has to be consistent. So if you're going to use a time frame stamp, make sure that it is you're not including time outside of your intervention, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And you'll see a lot of intervention studies ask ever at baseline and then 12 months at follow-up, but I would just suggest, using the same time frame at both your pre-test and your post-test, and yes, making sure they don't overlap. And so great question. So if your post-test is 3 months later, you'd want to change it to 3 months because it hasn't been 12 months since your pre-test. So, yeah.
And again, I think this is a really good example about how these measures have been designed to be epidemiological versus evaluated in a program context. So I think that's a really important question. There's another question that's related to that is, what length of time do you recommend for post-program measuring of impact?
You're asking all the really hard questions we don't have answers to. This really depends on what you think is reasonable for the behavior that you're measuring. So certainly for perpetration, depending on the age range, it may need to be quite a while just to be able to pick up change. And so that's where it may not be possible to ask about that as an outcome. I'll just tell you, a lot of dating violence studies use immediate post-test you can definitely do, which you probably plan to do. If you can do another follow-up, that's great. A lot of dating violence studies will use 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months, depending on what kind of fits for the behaviors. Isn't a reasonable amount of time to see change. Some behaviors take quite a while to happen. For bystander behavior, like we're measuring, we want to make sure they've had enough time to actually do it. And so it's sort of just trying to think about what fits best. And then honestly, it's a bit of a guess. So for us, we did a pilot 6 month, which is a huge luxury and something I've never been able to do before to make sure things were holding. Our ultimate outcome is going to be 12 months, but normally we just kind of look and think about the behavior, think about the developmental trajectory, and do we think that in this amount of time, we're likely to see change? Is it enough time to see change in behavior? Do they need more time? So it's an imperfect science. So I would say for most things, 3 months would be great, or, even if you can do 6 months, that's great. I mean, to really have something be evidence-based, we want to look at a year or more, but, 3 or 6 months for initial follow-up would be great.
So just to be clear, because I think you were making a really important point, is that you want to evaluate pre and post, but then you want to evaluate at some post time, like follow-up time down the road. And that asks, actually, when you evaluate at pre and post, what you're just getting is, did the program work from beginning to end of program? And when you're asking at the follow-up, you're saying, the question is, are you able to sustain that change, or maybe did the change occur later? Did it take longer to take place?
Yeah, because some things take a while to develop. So normally at post, we would measure attitudes and knowledge change. We would definitely hope to see that by then. And then for the longer term follow-ups, we might want to start to see some of those behavioral intentions emerge. And just thinking about, for that particular behavior in your population, what is a reasonable amount of time for them to have enough time to make the change.
Okay, and so it all comes back to your logic model, and what do you think will change when?
Yes.
Okay, there's another question. It says, does teen dating violence differentiate between dating violence with power and behaviors without that context?
No. So dating violence, we know, is used for a lot of different reasons, very much depending on the youth that you're working with. So certainly as a form of power and control, also in some relationships as poor conflict negotiation. And so dating violence measures do not ask about power and control or context in the way that bullying measures do, and that they would prime it in the definition. So for dating violence, we give them a definition of dating. We often say, don't count if you did it in self-defense, but that's it. So again, a limitation is we don't really understand what was going on in that relationship or why somebody was using those behaviors. That is something, again, if someone endorses a behavior, you could prompt them for. But dating violence scales really come from the conflict tactics world of measurement with adults, and so focus a lot on acts and not context, which is a really huge limitation, and where the importance of collecting both quantitative and qualitative or other arts-based data comes up, because we know something happened from the quantitative, but we need the qualitative to tell us why. And so if you're interested in that, and I think it's an excellent question, I would suggest adding qualitative data collection to figure out what was going on when these things were happening. And for your youth, what is their situation, and what is the context within which dating violence is occurring. So you're pointing out all the massive limitations in the field, which is really good and good to be aware of as you go into measurement, because they're all really problematic.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering it. There was a couple of things I just want to thank you, because this was really a comprehensive overview. And first of all, you really took us from the beginning about creating that logic model to understand what your outcomes are, putting your program on top of that logic model to make sure that you're then going to measure the kinds of things that are within your program and the kinds of outcomes that you would expect. Understanding and thinking about that developmental theory that intentions will change before behavior. Really important in thinking about how we measure things. And then you brought us right down to the level of, here are different types of measures for those different kinds of behaviors and attitudes and knowledge. So really a comprehensive, thorough, and very thoughtful presentation, and a lot of golden nuggets in there. And so really on behalf of PREVNet and the Community of Practice, want to thank you for this excellent presentation. I also want to take the opportunity to remind everyone that we will be putting this up. So you will be able to download it and listen to it in the future if you want to go back for reference points. As well, we will be sending out the compendium for all of those who are on the call today. We have some final little edits we're going to add, mostly to include things like the great photo voice opportunity. And last but not least, I'd like to remind you to fill out the post-evaluation link. We, again, want to make sure that we're meeting your needs and putting on the kind of presentations that are interesting to you and relevant to the work that you do. And so we would really appreciate your feedback. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time today, and have a great rest of the day. And thank you again, Deinera, for a most excellent presentation. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.